Right. So, hello everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this year's conference, and especially Dan Osland, for being open to a panel of this type, and also for allowing me to send my talk in from afar. And since this is the first Heterodox Classics panel, I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about what the Heterodox Classics group is and what we had in mind for this panel, as well as for the second Heterodox Classics panel that will be, by the way, at the UK Classical Association Conference in Swansea this April. Heterodox Classics is one of a number of so-called heterodox communities. They're all offshoots of the Heterodox Academy, which is an international association of academics who seek to defend and foster viewpoint diversity, respectful disagreement, and open conversations within academia. And I'm really grateful to Dr. Megan Daniels, and Professor Louise Hitchcock for agreeing to contribute to this panel, and really happy that the panel represents a genuinely heterodox combination of viewpoints. And hopefully there'll be a good discussion after the talk. My only regret is that I won't be there in person. It's about 2 a.m. Over here when this will be when you'll be hearing this. So you'll forgive me if I passed on the opportunity to Skype in for the Q&A. Now, one of Heterodox Academy's central set of concerns has to do with the consequences of a lack of diversity, both in terms of gender, race, sexuality, and so forth, and in terms of political, social, and religious affiliations on the academic world and the scholarship and science produced by it. John HAIDT, in his book, The Righteous Mind, has marshaled a range of evidence to argue that people of different political and religious perspectives in particular tend not just to disagree about what conclusions to draw, but they also look at problems in a different way and even draw on different ethical values in doing so. So these are what HAIDT calls moral foundations. The moral perspectives that people take up can also lead to certain conceptual blind spots, areas in which we're particularly inclined to explain evidence that seems to go against our pre-existing worldview, explain away evidence that seems to go against our pre-existing worldview, rather than re-examining our fundamental assumptions. Unless we can address these blind spots, ideally by working together in a spirit of joint inquiry with those who are ideologically different to us, these blind spots risk distorting our view of reality in a range of academic fields, and there's no reason to think that classics would be any different. In his 2002 book, The Blank Slate, subtitled The Modern Denial of Human Nature, the Harvard cognitive scientist Steven Pinker makes a pitch at describing a blind spot that he thinks can affect and has affected social scientists and humanists in particular. This is a resistance to the idea that all humans share a basic biological makeup, that it's remained more or less stable throughout recorded human history, and that lays some of the groundwork for how we conceive of the world and how we behave within it. In other words, the idea of human nature. And this resistance, Pinker thinks, exists in spite of the fact that the modern conception of human nature rests on two very firm foundations of Darwin's theory of natural selection and Mendelian genetics, which have long held the field as the best available paradigms for how organisms evolved and how they continue to organize themselves. And we could add to this that subsequent lines of research in behavioral genetics, twin and adoption studies, cognitive psychology, behavioral economics, comparative anthropology, and many others besides have only added to our level of certainty that our species' shared genetic code, passed down with continual but minor changes by sexual reproduction, has provided a relatively constant backdrop for the development of different cultures throughout human history. Now, classicists in particular haven't in the past been allergic to the concept of human nature, and as we'll see, they've been comfortable identifying it in Thucydides in particular and other ancient sources. So what I'm going to do today is just flag a couple of places where I think I can detect contemporary classicists betraying a growing suspicion of this idea. Of course, it may turn out that I'm completely wrong about this, and contemporary classicists have no problem discussing the idea of a stable human nature. That would be wonderful, since that would be a possible form of bias that we could congratulate ourselves on having dealt with, on not having. So after discussing a couple of possible examples, including a recent reading of Thucydides, an example I'll go into in some depth, I'll then come to some possible reasons why scholars might be suspicious of human nature, why this suspicion might be emerging, if it is. And I'll try to provide some reassurance that these reasons aren't as strong as we might take them to be, reasons to be suspicious. And along the way, we'll encounter some examples of how the idea has been rejected or indeed taken into account in contemporary work in our field. So for the first area where we might want to be on guard against doing away with the whole idea of human nature, I turn to an interview on the website Vox with Donna ZUCKERBERG, whose book Not All Dead White Men, Classics and Misogyny in the Digital Age, discussed the use of classical themes by the alt-right. Now in that interview, Zuckerberg ascribes most of this ideology to, and I quote, ideas taken from evolutionary psychology about normal, natural human behavior. Now, many of Zuckerberg's criticisms of the extreme fringes of the internet are salutary and well taken, and she's also probably right that some of them come from inaccurate folk versions of evolutionary psychology. We should also be careful, of course, to avoid moving from the idea that something's natural in a descriptive sense to claims about its moral worth. Of course, we can see particular natural tendencies as good or bad. At the same time, we should also bear in mind that the particular uses some individuals make of a set of ideas doesn't invalidate the entire paradigm. And we should remember that whatever particular hypothesis we may be skeptical of, often rightly, I think, the evolutionary account of human origins and behavior remains the mainstream paradigm in contemporary psychology. So there's a danger here, I think, of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. A second case I want to discuss, which we'll go into in a lot more length, this can also serve as an illustration of how the way we look at the idea of human nature might feed into our interpretation of a classical text and thus affect our view of the ancient world. And this also has the benefit of allowing me to come at last to the phrase quoted in my title, kata to anthropinon. This phrase, as most of you will know, occurs in a programmatic section of Thucydides 122, which is number 1 on the handout in Greek, if you like Greek. Where the historian hopes his work will be judged useful by those desiring an accurate knowledge of what's happened in the past, something similar to which will happen in the future, according to Thucydides, and kata to anthropinon. So, what does this mean? Well, what does that phrase mean? Well, literally it means something like, according to the human thing, which is a very literal translation. Is a phrase that Mark Hogan borrowed for the title of his book on the bibliography. But of course, according to the human thing isn't a sequence of words that's readily comprehensible to an English speaker, or it's hard to tell exactly what that means. Rex Warner, in his Penguin Classics translation, goes for human nature being what it is. And I would defend that translation, or something like it, even though it seems to have fallen pretty thoroughly out of fashion. So Hornblower, in his commentary, I say relatively recent commentary, Hornblower says the phrase is broader than according to human nature. This is still Hornblower. He says, it means something like the human condition or the human situation. And Hornblower cites Hans-Peter Stahl's argument to that effect. Now, in my view, though, Geoffrey de St. Croix long ago put Stahl's arguments to rest, and he raised some questions of his own which make it virtually certain in my mind that Thucydides had a concept of human nature in mind here. For example, if Thucydides was using the phrase to refer to human situations that tend to recur, what work is being done by the rest of the sentence, which already expresses the idea about situations of the past recurring again in the future? So Thucydides probably thought he was adding something extra by adding the phrase kata to anthropinon, and this something might well have been an explanation for why he thinks similar situations are indeed likely to recur, because there's a significant extent to which human beings are the same or very similar throughout history. De St. Croix also lists about a dozen passages in which Thucydides uses expressions like anthropeia physis, human nature, straightforwardly, or he physis ton anthropon, the nature of the humans. And these phrases and passages collectively suggest that an interpretation of to anthropinon as human nature is extremely plausible. So see handout number 2 for a list of those passages. Now, all I'll add to St. Croix's points is that even if we go with the translation, the human condition or the human situation or something like that, Thucydides would still, of course, be talking about human nature, at least in part. And that's because the idea that there's a constant or constantly recurring human situation or human condition, that makes very little sense unless we assume that humans tend to do things in predictable ways, whatever historical or geographical context they're in. Now, some translators have shied away from talking about human nature. Other recent interpreters of Thucydides have taken a tack that it's fascinating in itself and it's not without merit, it's a tack that I think might suggest a certain discomfort with a substantive account of human nature, at least an account of a certain sort. Now, the suggestion I'm making here, the argument I'm making here is a subtle one, a delicate one, because the scholars I have in mind do actually seem to acknowledge in places that Thucydides had an account of human nature, but I think they also show a tendency to identify it with our disposition towards certain types of irrationality and delusion to such an extent that they downplay the more substantive parts of Thucydides' views about the wellsprings of human behavior, and even go a step further and talk about how Thucydides is really saying that there's no possibility of any substantive theory in any field of human inquiry. So Charles Reeve, in an article called Thucydides on Human Nature, he laudably makes clear that Thucydides is making an empirical claim about the way humans are, but then he concludes that his most valuable lesson is to be found in a dissatisfaction with easy answers, and a deep appreciation for the complexity of human affairs. Neville Morley strikes a similar vein in his extensive recent commentaries online and hard copy as well. Extensive recent commentaries on the reception of Thucydides in the modern world, and particularly in modern international rights theory. So Morley writes, for example, that through Thucydides' work, and I'm quoting Morley here, we are made to recognize that the world is complex, that it is shaped through the ideas we develop to try to interpret it, that we have to simplify things and resort to principles and rules of thumb in order to make sense of it, but that every time we do that, we risk misunderstanding and worse. So I agree, actually, that reading of Thucydides can do all of these things, and I also fully acknowledge that what Morley says about our tendency to resort to heuristics here is a partial description, and even a correct one, of the way Thucydides saw the human mind. But Morley also has this tendency to go further and claim that what Thucydides' text really does is to offer us a variety of interpretive approaches. So he goes on, each approach, he writes, is shown to be ultimately inadequate as a complete explanation, and the same goes for all other approaches. Now for me, this takes things ever so slightly too far, and that it would seem to entail that Thucydides thought that all approaches to the world were ultimately inadequate. And I find that difficult to square with the substantive view of human nature that I think we can see in Thucydides' text, and that Morley also appears to find there in other moments. And I would add that I see this substantive conception of human nature as significantly thicker, more contentful than Morley's account of it, mainly in terms of irrationality. To take just one passage that inclines me in this direction, in his vivid description of civil war in Corcyra, Thucydides comments, this is number 3, by the way, on the handout, Thucydides comments that the sufferings were many and horrible, of the sort that have and always will take place, as long as the nature of humans, Hephusis ton anthropon, is the same. Now, it's possible, I suppose, that Thucydides thinks that the horrific violence in Corcyra has been caused simply by our tendency towards getting things wrong. But I think it's more likely that he's making a prediction about certain types of suffering that are predictable because we have certain other tendencies, especially those that many other commentators have seen as key for Thucydides, that is, fear and a desire for power. After all, if Thucydides' account of human nature consisted exclusively on the idea that we make mistakes, history would have little to tell us besides just to be very careful. But then there would be little reason to recount the actuality of what happened in the recent past, or Thucydides' recent past, in such detail, in the expectation that something similar would happen in the future. Okay, well that's probably more than enough Thucydides for one session, especially a paper that's meant to be more about human nature and classics in general. So in what remains, I'd like to turn to some possible reasons historians and classicists might have to be suspicious of the idea of a trans-historical human nature, why they might be suspicious if that's indeed the case. And I'll make some attempt at reassurance. And again, if it turns out that nobody actually has any objection to the idea, then there's no problem, so that's great. So one reason there might be an issue is an understandable one, that historians, like anthropologists, are used to looking in great detail at particular periods of human history, periods in which things are so different that they make the past seem, to draw on an old cliché, like a foreign country. It's natural then that we should become very familiar with the undeniably great difference that cultural change can make. And yet, as Pinker is at pains to point out, the only reasonable answer to the old question, nature or nurture, is now both. most human behaviors and inclinations have been shown to have some element of both genetic and cultural influence. And although it would be impossible to explain the variety of historical cultures with reference to biological continuities alone, we can also go too far in the other direction, acting as if human nature played no part. In Michel Foucault's notion of epistemes, as many of you will know, different ideological frameworks provide the foundation for knowledge and discussion in different cultural spaces or periods. Now, it's an interesting concept that can often shed light on the way different periods can seem to constitute entirely different worlds. And yet we should remember, too, that there are always continuities, not only in the way the physical world works, but in the way humans and human brains do, at least within recorded periods of human history. The noted historian of Athens, Greg Anderson, has recently argued that in order to retrieve lost worlds of the past, such as Athens, we need to, and I quote, reconsider the very nature of realness itself, and to make sense of each modern life world on its own ontological terms, as a distinct world in its own right, a very Foucauldian vein. In a review, Anderson even states that classical Athens rested upon profoundly different metaphysical foundations to our own. So what Anderson seems to mean is that Athenians looked at the world in a profoundly different way. They looked at the world in a profoundly different way than the way that we do because of their culture, and especially, in his view, their religion. And that strikes me as undeniable and also important and interesting. At the same time, though that thought that they looked at the world in a different way would seem to justify the claim that the Athenians' world rested on different epistemological foundations to our own. They had a different theory of understanding and knowledge. The idea that it was different metaphysically, as Anderson states, or ontologically, as he also sometimes states, that would seem to make the very ambitious claim that the nature of the world changes according to what people think in different ages, and that, I think, is implausible. And we can go further still, since even the idea that the Athenians thought about the world differently, though accurate, it needs to be constrained by what we know about the complex but often predictable tendencies of the human brain, a very complicated object that's nonetheless retained pretty much the same design since the age of Pericles, and even earlier than that. So the idea of human nature doesn't replace the influence of culture or historical change or do away with it, but it can supplement and constrain it in a useful way. It gives human history the continuity without which it would be nothing more than a series of inexplicable lurches from one thought world to the next. Now, another reason that you might be suspicious of the idea of human nature is if we associate it with a simplistic view in which humans always act selfishly, or indeed rationally. Now, it's unclear to me the extent to which this was ever a widespread view. I mean, even Homo economicus, of course, was usually presented as a useful approximation of human behavior, wasn't meant as an exhaustive account. But in any case, in recent decades, research has seemed to confirm that humans, besides having proclivities to self-regarding behavior, are also naturally cooperative in some ways. You can look at Michael Tomasello's book listed on the handout for a good summary and discussion of some recent experiments and studies on that front. And research has also identified a number of ways in which, as in Morley's account of Thucydides, humans suffer from consistent types of irrationality in decision-making. So they are irrational, but they're also predictably irrational, to borrow the title of Dan Ariely's book, which can also serve as a useful introduction to the research on that topic in behavioral economics and other fields. Now, one school of thought within ancient history that I've been marginally involved in myself is the study of political institutions and economic history through the lens of these human tendencies, a subfield known as the New Institutional Economics, or NIE, which produces the punny title by Verboven on the handout, the Knights Who Say Ni. So the New Institutional Economics began in the 70s with a more classical emphasis on the utility maximizing side of human behavior, which does retain a certain predictive value. But as Conrad Verboven emphasizes in his excellent assessment of the theory's use in ancient history, it has in more recent years successfully integrated the key insights of behavioral economics. That is, that we also have pro-social and less than perfectly rational aspects to our nature. And the new institutional economics model has been employed very productively, I think, by scholars from a range of different traditions, from the so-called Stanford School of Ancient Economic History, represented above all by the Cambridge Economic History of the Greco-Roman World, edited by Scheidel, Morris, and Saller. But it's also been taken up by scholars from other traditions from Europe, such as Alain Bresson and Elio Locascio. A final type of suspicion about the idea of human nature in some way repeats the concerns about oversimplification that we've just discussed, but this time does it with a moral edge. So here the concern is, can't ideas of human nature get things badly wrong and be abused with terrible repercussions? The short answer to this is yes, absolutely. And I probably don't need to rehearse for this audience the story of how Aristotle's doctrines of natural slavery or of the relative or of the irrationality of women were later used to justify various sorts of colonialism, slaveholding, and misogyny. Aristotle's theory of human nature then, though in some ways is quite a pro-social one, it's a good example in many of its particulars of how theories of human nature can get things wrong, can be both inaccurate and also harmful. All the same, it would obviously be fallacious to conclude from this that every theory of human nature is wrong, or that current mainstream scientific views on the topic are necessarily unsound or dangerous. It should go without saying, of course, that Aristotle was working at a time when biological science was in its infancy, and indeed he was one of its midwives. And it should go without saying, I think, that things have moved on a bit since then. And if Aristotle's account of human nature and the origin of human communities leads in Politics Book 1 to some very dark places, it's worth remembering, as Pinker is again at pains to stress, that a belief that a stable human nature exists is compatible and has been compatible and combined with a range of social and political visions. And that seems true of the ancient world as much as of the modern. Since this is such an important point, I want to stress this in closing in true Platonic fashion with a mythos, or fable, and actually a Platonic fable at that. The fable I have in mind is the one in the so-called Great Speech from Plato's Protagoras, a passage I've written about in connection with theories of human nature before, in which the eponymous philosopher, Protagoras of Abdera, gives an account of the origins of humans, just as Aristotle would do later, or origin of human communities, at least in Politics Book 1. And I would stress here that Plato's Protagoras uses the word anthropos throughout, something that's often obscured, and has been obscured in the past by English translations using the word man, as humans in general, it's not just males. As most of you will again know, Protagoras tells us that Epimetheus messed up the distribution of qualities to the various living beings that had been created. So he handed out things like the ability to fly or live underground to the animals, but he left humans defenseless. To remedy this, Prometheus stepped in and gave them practical smarts, as I would translate it, strangely, and technon sophian, gave them practical smarts. He also gave them fire, but that wasn't enough, and soon Zeus himself was forced to send in Hermes to distribute a conscience and a sense of justice, eidos and dike, shame and justice. He distributed eidos and dike to every human being, qualities which, in combination, Protagoras tells us, make up a capacity to live together in communities, a politike techne, or an arete, shifts between the two. So an ability, an expertise, or virtue, or capacity that allows us to live in a community, in a polis. Oops. Sorry about that. I thought I dropped the PowerPoint just a few seconds before the end. So I'll have to record a separate video and then see if I can merge it with the first one. All right. Hopefully that wasn't too distracting, me saying oops like that. So yeah, the politike techne, or the politike arete mentioned by Protagoras, a capacity to live together in a polis, political community. And I've just put a recent artist impression of polis on the slide. As with most Platonic mythoi, we're almost certainly not meant to take this literally, especially considering that it's spoken by a sophist, one of whose extant fragments declares, concerning the gods, I have no means of knowing whether they exist or not, etc. So what we have here instead, I'd suggest, is an account of human nature, not made in our terms, but made in the terms that would have been readily accessible to a typical Greek of the 5th century BC. And it is, in contrast to Thucydides, an account of human nature that stresses our ability, according to the story, uniquely among living beings, to transcend suffering and destruction, not just through an individual striving for survival, but also through cooperation. And on that note, I hope you'll enjoy the discussion, even if your cooperation mainly takes the form of you all agreeing about how wrong I am about everything. I think I guess I should say at the end as well that anyone interested in Heterodox Classics wants to learn more from whatever perspective, just contact me via my university email address on the handout, and you'd be most welcome. So yeah, enjoy the other two talks.